to this ERA session on the state of global education in European countries. Welcome to everybody. We just wait 1 or 2 another minutes before we will then start. So, dear colleagues, a warm welcome to this session on the state of global education in European countries and the future of educational research. This session is organized by the Global Education Network Europe, GENE. GENE is an umbrella organization of European ministries and agencies working in the field of development education, global learning, and global citizenship education, and it's funded by the European Union and the ministries and agencies themselves. The objective of GENE is to provide quality global education to every European. We thank ERA President Professor Joe O'Hara and others in the leadership of ERA for their very kind invitation to organize one of the 4 ERA sessions. And having worked with ERA colleagues on the GENE ERA Award over the past year, we are very honored and delighted to have this opportunity. My name is Annette Scheunpflug. I'm professor for foundations in education at the University of Bamberg in Germany, and I'm the chairperson of GENE of the Global Education Network Europe. This session is registered, and this session will be you can if you want, you can Twitter, but now, yes, that's like it. Please do Twitter if you want. So the ECER conference this year is on education and society, expectations, prescriptions, reconciliation. The relation between education and society is characterized, as the program's writing, by a tension between the very high expectations what education should do and look like, and the reality of the everyday practice. And this tension is particularly visible in regard to globalization, because there's the expectation that learning is more than the readiness to economic fitness and technological smartness. And then we know that the experience dealing with globalization and the demands of sustainability requires learning other than economic fitness and technological smartness. And this has become more visible than ever. With the Sustainable Development Goals, clear expectations were formulated for the international community. People must learn to shape globalization in a way that it is socially just, ecological sustainable, economically enabling and worth living for all life, and with respect and compliance with human rights, and without racism, and in a decolonized way. And we call this kind of learning global learning. However, in our work in GENE with ministries and agencies, we see that these expectations are slowly realized. Policymakers show increasing and sustained willingness to learn from each other and to share policy learning across borders. But nevertheless, in terms of conceptual development, but also concerning implementations, there are clear challenges. And only a few examples may show this. The recent and ongoing pandemic shows lack of understanding, complexity, and related solidarity on a global, national, and on a local, national, and global level. And in the context of understanding the climate change, and now with the experiences of a summer of climate disasters and emergencies, there's growing recognition and that the understanding of this complexity of climate change needs to be learned, and that we need creativity, new methods, imagination, and motivation for action in relation to a deep solidarity with future generations. And in the light of recent global, regional, and local conflicts and the failure of warful responses to develop sustainable solutions, so we learn that reconciliation, mutual respect, and social problem solving is very much required. So the idea of reconciliation is very important. This tension, and we see that this tension between the learning challenges of sustainability and global solidarity needs intensive research efforts, and research can contribute to this kind of reconciliation. We already see a variety of activities, and the various presentations at the ECER conference now show this, but nevertheless, these efforts need to be strengthened, and there we want to contribute. So the purpose of this session is to outline to the broader educational research community some of the key concerns and developing research agendas in the field of global education. We will honestly outline emerging research agenda in the field and we hope that the broader ERA community might be inspired by this. So the first presentation will focus on global learning and global citizenship education and the advent and origins where this is coming from. Then we will have a presentation about global education research, global education as a research field in a general view. Then we will reflect on an example and learn from that global education research in Finland, and then get some glimpse and some overviews about global education in Europe. So we will have these presentations. You will have the possibility, and please do this, to ask questions either in the chat or then during the discussion. And I hope very much that we will have a very lively and fruitful debate together. And I'm very delighted to introduce now our first presenter. So Professor Douglas Bourn is a professor of global education at the Institute of Education at the University College of London, and he is the founder of the Development Education Research Center. And I think he has dedicated a big part of whole his career to the understanding and conceptualization of global citizenship education. So I'm very delighted to give the floor now to Doug. Doug, please.
Thank you, Annette. Kind words. Well, I'm deliberately not going to use a PowerPoint this morning because I'm sure a lot of people will be using PowerPoints, but I just wanted to talk, to be honest, more from my heart about this introduction, this subject, and I found it easier just to talk to you direct, because I have someone who's been involved in this area of work for over 30 years, and I'm very conscious that this field of global education and global citizenship education has probably for the first time at an ECER conference had quite a high profile through a range of seminars and events and contributions, including this one. So to me, it reflects the growing interest and enthusiasm for this field of educational work around Europe and beyond. And so my contribution this morning is just to give a bit of historical context to that and what I think that tells us about the current interest in this field, where that has come from and what challenges it presents. And so I want to start that since the 1970s, there's been a growing body of educational practice. I deliberately use the word educational practice that is aimed to promote a global understanding of global and international development issues. This has taken many different labels, from initially the terms of development education to global education, education for international understanding, education for sustainable development, and more recently, global citizenship education. The evolution of these terms and how they've been interpreted is well documented in a number of publications, but what to me they represent is the ways in which a growing educational field has adapted to the current social, economic, and political context, and that labels themselves just reflect the changing priorities and needs. And I think that's quite an important thing to say in way of starting off, because there's been a lot of discussion in this field about what are we talking about. To me, they're underlying a series of educational principles that my fellow contributors will outline more this morning. But to me, what is interesting about this area of work is that in most countries around Europe and beyond, it started from educational practice, from the practice of civil society organizations, rather than from academia or policy. And it was in a sense in which organizations around Europe and beyond were asking questions: how do we equip learners, whether they're young or adult, to make sense and understand the world in which they were living in? And that led to a whole number of initiatives by ministries across Europe and beyond. And particularly important within Europe was the support given to this field by the European Commission through funding a range of projects by civil society organizations, really from the 1980s onwards. Now that has meant there's been a body of educational practice that has actually encouraged innovation, creativity, about approaches to learning about global and international development issues. Important factor, however, in understanding the roots of this practice is a lot of this practice was tied to funding streams that had a relationship to international development and overseas aid. And that, to some extent, skewed, I think, in some respects, the direction of some of that practice and some of that work. And it also meant, in many cases, that the funding was based around learning towards predetermined outcomes. So there was a sense in which the creativity and innovation sometimes got a bit lost as funders came on stream and said, well, how does this contribute to building understanding of international development issues, and how does it contribute to support for overseas aid? Now, more recently, in the last 20 years or so, that focus has changed in many countries with a greater recognition you can't divorce talking about international development issues without talking about sustainability, without talking about human rights, cultural understanding, etc. So there's been a great broadening of the field. Why in many countries now people talk about global education or global learning or global citizenship education. And that sense, that evolution reflects that growth of interest. But it does raise questions and challenges for those of us engaged in academic research and education research, as this conference is about, which is what's the relationship of what's happening in terms of practice by civil society organizations to education research. And one of the challenges my research center has found, since it was founded in 2006, and as others will outline later, is the sense, how do you connect to and have some form of mutual learning between practitioners, policymakers, and academic research? And to me, that's a key challenge. And I think one of the things that we've been trying to evolve in this field of global education and global citizenship education over the past 10 or 15 years or so is trying to develop more as a body of independent academic research, not so much geared to how can we support predetermined agendas and policies from policymakers. Now, what's also been a factor in this growth of interest is the increasing interest from policymakers, be they national governments who recognize the importance that young people learn about global issues, or whether it's international bodies such as UNESCO, who now have major programs on global citizenship and education for sustainable development. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals launched a few years ago have some of these themes within Target 4.7 of the goals. So there's growing international policy recognition, but where do all these things come together? And I think that's one of the challenges that we're interested in exploring. That's one of the things we want to talk about more this morning. The other thing I think is important to raise in terms of my introductory remarks, in terms of context, is this body of educational practice and the growing interest academically is to some extent was seen as very much on the margins of educational research. I worked with a doctoral student in the UK over 20 years ago who talked about coming in from the margins, moving from the margins to the mainstream. And I think one of that reflects the ways in which some of these areas were seen, but also recognizes that I think that you can't divorce talking about these themes and issues about global citizenship, about global social justice, without recognizing they have ideological connotations and they have political agendas. So what has often been a factor of the growth and in some cases, the roller coaster ride of this field across Europe and beyond is the extent of its support from policymakers. And often there has been a political agenda that's influenced these things. So for example, where I'm based in the UK, under the period of the Labour government from 1997 to 2010, there was a great deal of funding and support for this area of work. But since 2010, since the Conservative government's been in power, there's been virtually no money. There's a sense in which this field is seen to be politically and ideologically driven, which is why we see the importance of independent academic research as a way of justifying these areas of work is important. But finally, I think I just want to say, in terms of bringing my thoughts together, is that this area of work also now reflects many of the current dominant societal agendas that are taking place around the world. So if we take, for example, the growing interest in decolonizing the curriculum, about looking at diversity and inclusion within education systems and ensuring that marginalized voices are reflected within educational practice. This has been a field of global education and global learning for over 30 years, but has tended to be lone voices. Now, it's not to say they've got the right answers to some of these issues, but they've got a contribution to make, and I think that's important. The second one is obviously the increasing interest in climate change and sustainability, and the sense in which global social justice themes and global citizenship are a way of making those things real. And finally, I think we've all lived through the COVID pandemic of the last 18 months. And to me, if that's about one thing, it shows that we are globally connected, that what happens in one country has an impact elsewhere. And many of us involved in this field have argued that global education and global learning is very much about how we understand the interconnectedness of our lives. And as Annette said in introduction, when she mentioned the importance and influence of globalization, that to me reflects, I think, many of the issues that I think are very current. So what I would say in conclusion is that I feel the field that we're talking about here this morning is very much high topic for today's educational research around Europe and beyond. But the challenge is, it is complex, it is in some cases politically driven and has ideological connotations, and raises real challenges to how we can ensure an approach towards education that's not too prescriptive, that encourages space for different voices and learning. And I look at some of my own thinking and writing in this area. I've looked particularly at the influence of the ideas of the Brazilian educationist Paulo Freire, who talks about a pedagogy of hope. And to me, the sense in which when we're talking about the needs and challenges of education today, I looked back to his ideas and thinking, because to me, global education and global learning is essentially about a pedagogy of hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doug. Oh, this was wrong. I wanted just to react, but okay. So thank you very much for this very personal and very nice introducing and words, which gave a good overview about where global education is coming from, where is it rooted in the practice and development movement, what does it mean for research and research challenges, and your player for independent academic research and reflecting all the challenges we are living through now in the moment. So thank you very much. And we go on with the presentation of Professor Massimiliano Tarozzi from who is the head of the International Research Center on Global Citizenship Education at the University of Bologna in Italy. And Massimiliano will report about a digest of research in global learning and speak about the growing research base of global education, and will outline some thematic topics and some aspects which are just emerging. So, Massimiliano, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Annette. So, global education as a research field, following what Doug had just mentioned in its development. Well, global education is a semantically indefinite concept. It seems to be informative only when you look at it from afar. The more you approach it, the more it vanishes and its definitory power decreases. It reminds what Herbert Blumer called a sensitizing concept, a construct that, unlike definitive concepts, doesn't have a clear definition. It is vaguely defined, but suggesting directions along which to look. On the one hand, thanks to this ambiguity and ethical neutrality, it can merge the agenda of diverse actors, combine dissimilar ideologies, and compass different national policies. But on the other hand, being a sensitizing concept, it makes trouble for practitioners in transforming this ghost pedagogical model into actual practices in the classrooms. Even more, it causes problem for researchers dealing with a foggy construct, not easy to be univocally defined. This conceptual vagueness makes difficult to identify a precise field of study, not even within the ERA community. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why networks of policymakers, NGOs and practitioners, but not researchers, have existed in Europe for decades, with the exception, of course, of the ANGEL, the Academic Network of Global Education and Learning, the network established in 2017 in close cooperation between GENE and the UCL Institute of Education. To exist, a field of study requires a community of researchers, which in turn calls for a shared field of study. Thomas Kuhn, in his seminal work, pointed out the circularity of community of scientists clustered around a shared paradigm, and a paradigm as the constellation of values, beliefs, and techniques universally recognized as a scientific, for a time, by a precise scientific community. So a community of scientists, to be qualified as such, is supposed to have received a common education and training, and to draw on the same literature from which they receive the same understanding. We can certainly question the Western-based perspective inherent in Kuhn's vision of the ideas of shared learning and same literature, but this theory properly portrays the current idea of mainstreaming paradigm or normal science in which we are all located. Against this background, the key questions about the epistemic space of global education arises. If global education and learning is supposed to be a community of scientists, what is its paradigm? In this presentation, I can just pick a tiny part of this philosophical question. Does this field rely on a wide-ranging and coherent body of literature in which a community can recognize itself? My answer is yes. Global education is a research field in which a community can recognize themselves, and yes, the scientific area is grounded in a consistent literature, and its size and scope has been growing tremendously in the last decade. In the following, I will provide evidence of this development by exploring major scholarly databases and reporting results from a multilingual review ANGEL carried out. To investigate the number of academic publications in the field of global education in the last decade, I compared a bibliographic database, Web of Science, with a scholarly search engine tool, Google Scholar. Together with Scopus, Web of Science is the most influential bibliographic data source traditionally used for journal selection, research evaluation, bibliometric analysis, and other tasks, including university ranking and scholar productivity assessment, etc. I'm highly critical of these forms of scientometrics and the supposed objectivity and neutrality of the tools for measuring it. But for the purposes of this paper, Web of Science is perfectly suitable to show how the scientific discourse work in establishing which subject or scholars are included in or excluded from the international scientific community delimited by a dominant paradigm. By the way, ironically, The Structure of Scientific Revolution by Thomas Kuhn is one of the most cited academic books of all time. I will couple this data with the search engine Google Scholar, as mentioned. Unlike a scholarly database which have limited coverage and journal indexes are selected after review, Google Scholars is more inclusive because results are captured from the World Wide Web, but they are unsupervised. I'll try to share my screen now to show some slides. Okay. So the first slide compared the use of different terms: global citizenship education, education for sustainable development, and global education in the last decade. They are widely used within the research community to label this research area, very often used as synonyms or complementary concepts. Web of Science and Google Scholar provide similar results in terms of distribution. Education for sustainable development has significantly increased compared to the other. It's worth mentioning that while the term global education has been widely used at European level after the Maastricht Declaration in 2002, in the literature, in technical literature, it appears to be especially ambiguous and semantically unclear because it encompasses not only global learning, but also international and comparative educational research at global level. The following slides show the growing number of publications indexed in Web of Science and captured by Google Scholar in the last 10 years. Here, I use the global citizenship education because it's less ambiguous search term to univocally identify the area. Both tools show a significant growth in the number of publications, even impressive in Google Scholar, with some up and downs in Web of Science. However, there is an imbalanced distribution of languages. If we compare the countries of publication and global citizenship education items and the languages of publication, we immediately realize that most scholars tend to publish in English, which is the lingua franca of international academic community. This is also because Web of Science is mostly record English journal. This graph illustrates the linguistic asymmetries languages barrier within the academic publishing. This unequal distribution of languages, particularly relevant for Europe, led angel researchers to multiply languages in systematically reviewing publication in global education. Since 2017, Angel has published a comprehensive reasoned bibliography on global education, the Digest, which in 2020 included 6 languages, and in this coming edition, 8 of them. The Digest, which is downloadable for free from the Angel website, also provides more comprehensive global trends in this area. Next slide, for example, show that among the 2,744 publications in the last 5 years, the most emerging themes are theoretical analysis, conceptual analysis, and research in formal education in school, for example. The last slide is also interesting because almost 300 books have been published in the last 6 years in 8 languages, and only 42 of them are in English. Of the almost 1,600 journal articles, about half are in English. That means that if we only read English literature, we are unaware of half of the scientific production in Europe. So, and this is something that should be think about. So let me conclude. Global education is a well-defined research field based on a coherent and wide-range literature. With few exceptions, it is also a research area that has been booming over the last decade. However, the large majority of works, as for almost all educational research field, is published in English, and the consequences of this asymmetry cannot be ignored, especially in a field which is global by definition. According to a post-colonial perspective, which plays a pivotal role in any global education study, doing research in a monolingual globalized world reveals that linguistic difference is often linked to a power differential, even within the scientific community. Gayatri Spivak critically discussed the hegemonic monolinguistic culture in which both writers and readers are immersed. This is why in global education is crucial to unveil the issue of hegemonic power of English within a global social scientific community in Europe and beyond, and especially to give voice to scholars in the global South. To resist this trend, it is certainly important to provide visibility and recognition to empower languages other than English, and the Multilingual Digest project promoted by Angel surely goes in that direction, especially now that the digest will be transformed into a freely searchable digital archive. But it is not enough. It is also important to engage in translating, in my opinion. Translation is a challenging interpretive act of linguistic hospitality of the original text as a foreigner in our own language, which requires sophisticated dialogical skill, and as such, it is a means consistent with the end of global education. In the field of global education and learning, it is an intercultural act, welcoming another language in our own, which create a negotiated dialogical horizon. And this is a field worth to be further explored. In this sense, multilingualism and translation could be critical tools to further expand the global education research field in a more equitable and dialogical way.
Thank you very much, Massimiliano, for this very broad overview on the discourse, for the broad multicultural, multilinguistic perspective, and for the awareness on language and cultural relationships between global education, global citizenship education, and languages and the form how to express. And I think it is a very, very important contribution to research, to make research on global issues visible in very different languages, and by this creating possibilities of learning from each other as a discourse and research community. So thank you very much for your inspiring thoughts. And the next speaker will move from these general overviews to a research case study in Finland. And as the most persons of us do not read Finnish, it is very interesting to listen and to hear from the experiences on global learning in this part of Europe. Professor Elina Lehtomäki will speak, and she is a full professor of global education, and I think this is one of the single specific dedications to global education for a chair in Europe. So a full professor of global education at the University of Oulu in Finland, and a co-founder of the Finnish Research Network on Global Education. So Elina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Annette, for the kind introduction. Yes, this is really a case within Europe and world research community. We now move on to Finland, and I would like to talk about the Finnish emerging research and also emerging research community, which I think is very important also when we think about education and the challenges in our societies, and we think about the future of research, but also future of not only Europe, but of the globe, as we heard. Connecting sustainability, connecting the global responsibility are the key issues in my work. And I would like to tell you a little bit how we have sort of, could I say, nurtured the research community here in Finland, trying to increase the voice, not only the volume, but also the voice in dialogue with the policymakers, with teachers, teacher educators, and involving younger generations of researchers in the work that we do. And I would like to show you some of the pictures that I want to highlight, which I hope help us to see where we are going, where we are now, and where we are going from here. And in Finland, this research, as we heard, is still an emerging field. And I would like to touch very briefly what are the key issues we have in our research here right now, and what we have had. Where do we come from? What did we find in the review of the research conducted in Finland? In Finland, we claim that our education system is research informed, and yet we have had very little evidence of how this research addressing themes of global education and learning have influenced our teaching and learning in schools. And so I would like to talk very briefly also about the research network we have established here in Finland, which is working in collaboration with Angel, with a global network, and has been inspired by the Angel's activities. And we were happy to host one of the conferences for early career researchers here in Finland. I would also like to mention very briefly the neglected dimensions. And then how do we then construct, after identifying the gaps in research and the neglected dimensions, how do we then see the potential? How do we construct future research and respond to the emerging educational research agendas, also influenced certainly by challenges in our society, including COVID, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and all this. What do these things mean in our education and in our understanding of the global connections? And so I will look at the explore the research themes, and then explain what do these mean in our education system. And we identified in the review themes that are missing in our research, but also themes or dimensions related to the Maastricht Declaration from 2002 that emphasized 5 areas in global education and learning. And we found that intercultural education was very much emphasized in research in Finland over this period of 10 years. And the reason to that was certainly increased migration to the country, refugee crises around the world, and teachers felt the need. And we thought one of the reasons was certain researchers' interests, but also pragmatic need to guide practices in schools. And education for sustainable development was emphasized a lot, especially by UNESCO, with a decade for education for sustainability. And that also inspired research here in Finland as well. And sustainability was connected to Agenda 2030, the UN Sustainable Development Goals that Finland is also committed to. But much less did we do research in development education, human rights education, and education for peace and conflict prevention. And we could see that international cooperation influenced this agenda, but also the continuous dialogue between the government, non-governmental organizations, and academia, which is characteristic to the Finnish education development processes over, could I say, centuries. That it has been this continuous dialogue, and sometimes rather critical dialogue as well. And then when we look at what we do in global education research here in Finland, we identified also the need for a growing interest of researchers, but also encouraging academic debate. And that is why we established this global education research network in Finland to further encourage this academic debate and cooperation. As Massimiliano earlier said, feeling that the concept is not maybe always well defined. What do we mean by global education research? And this is something that we think we need to bridge also the gaps between research and practice, because it's not clear for practitioners what do we mean having this theme, global education and learning, as a cross-cutting issue in our national curriculum since 2014. But then what do teachers do in practice and how do they perceive it? And this kind of dialogue, again, between research, policy and practice encourages also researchers to contribute with the knowledge and then identify things. What do we mean by these concepts? Global citizenship education has its roots in internationalization of education, and we still interpret it differently in different education contexts. And in Finland, we identify the central themes we need to focus more on. And these are peace, equity, diversity, human rights, and sustainable development, and the connections between these. And then what we internationally understand as global education and learning. And this network has organized now 2 times sessions at the annual Finnish Educational Research Association conference in Finland. And also we have our presenters and presentations during this EERA, ECER conference here in Geneva. And we have some of our researchers contributing in different sessions and streams here. And this also shows us how wide the scope of global education is. And the network participates also in critical discussions on the positions and objectives of global education. And what is, I think, very promising is that we have research now encompassing early childhood education and care, basic education, secondary education, more than before, including technical and vocational education, higher education, non-formal education, lifelong learning, or as we call it in Finland nowadays, continuous learning. And this also shows that if you look at this global education in our education system, the emerging fields we can see, or the emerging research, has addressed now more recently early childhood education, and then pre-primary education. Basic education, we have more research on that, what happens in schools, and what happens in professional development. This is an emerging field. The role of civil society organizations is very strong when it comes to professional development of teachers, and teachers participate voluntarily in these professional development trainings. What we do know is also that it's now, we have new research addressing also vocational education, vocational qualifications. How can global educational learning themes be included there? And we do know that in university education, university students have claimed that we don't include enough issues related to sustainability in higher education programs. And there's a tendency now that all higher education institutions want to include sustainability, sustainable development, education, ESD, in their curricula for all students. So there's a research evidence of that we do see the need, but we still don't know how our teacher educators understand and perceive sustainable development goals, and especially Sustainable Development Goal 4.7, which is on global responsibility, global education and learning, having the competencies to understand the world, and then reflecting on worldviews critically, and understanding human rights. We don't have enough evidence what happens in teacher education yet. And an emerging field is also educational leadership. And our teachers all do have master's degrees, and then some of them continue and study further educational leadership. And now recently we are conducting research on educational leadership, because we do understand, and creating a research community in schools, learning communities in schools, requires involvement of leaders, teachers, students, and the community around, referring to parents, also civil society organizations around the schools. And these are complex issues, certainly. And then if we then combine this with continuous learning, we see that we could encompass the entire educational learning system in Finland. But then we have the wider world, because focusing on what we do nationally may not help us out. And that is why this kind of international connections are important here. And I would like to show you some examples what it means when Massimiliano mentioned also the issue of languages and what is we do. Our education system is offered in Finnish, Swedish, and basic education also in Sami, and we have early childhood education in Sami language. But then how do we understand ourselves in the world, which is at the core of global education and learning? And I would like to show you some examples of the recent trend we have in education research, which is conducting research with students, with teachers, with teacher educators, with educational leaders. And one example is of a book where we involved teachers working with us and as scholars, and also working with children and identifying stories related to their everyday life, and then think about what is the global connection of my everyday favorite things. And so this is from a recent guidebook for early years of schooling for teachers that we contributed with the topics related to global education and learning in collaboration with our teachers, and reflected on their practices. What does this mean? What does this mean in school? And how do we connect issues to the everyday lives of children in schools? And I'm sure there are examples of such things that are conducted in practice, but teachers don't always identify or connect these things to global learning. And it may be that this dialogue between research, policy, and practice can sort of broaden our understanding what is happening in schools, and at the same time, dialogue on concepts can evolve our understanding of what global education can be and mean. We also identified gaps and emerging areas in research, and the entire life course and stages in education, continues and life learning. And I think there's a tendency in Finland to look at more of the holistic picture, what happens in schools, whole school approach. We in our curriculum discuss whole school approach, but also we mention school culture. And this is where we need this leadership research. Anti-racism education is an emerging field. And this is something we have new scholars coming into the picture. And also with our focus on how do we understand racism. And there's evidence that we have neglected anti-racism or neglecting the evident racism, because people just don't have the observations interpreted and understood in schools, in everyday life, what happens. And conflict prevention and democracy education have been emerging fields now because of increasing issues related to bullying and related to the sense of belonging or to the lack of sense of belonging. And there's more research now on early childhood education and care, vocational and technical education. And what happens here is also that we need to understand that all these different levels of our education system are important, not only so that we have them as some events at some stages, but we need to have it as a continuous theme throughout the education system. And as I said earlier, teacher education, leadership, and educational institutions as responsible research communities are in the picture now in our research. And we are also trying to find these connections between the eco-social civilization, which is now mentioned in our curriculum, but less so in teacher education, and sustainability, global citizenship education. What are the connections? What is still lacking is global education in our society. What is it? How is it perceived? We still work very much within either within the civil society or education system, basic education. fields and not in looking into education and schooling in society. And social impact is very difficult to measure. But then transdisciplinary research is something that's I find very fascinated at the moment. And we have established connections and working with biodiversity researchers, anthropologists, researchers from other fields in order to include dimensions of sustainability as responsibility very closely related to 4.7, and we are now working on this issue with the Academy of Finland research program for the next years. And then in general, if I would look at research in Finland and globally and in Europe, several organizations have evaluated and created these measures to measure individual global competencies and global citizenship skills. And I see in Finland in our research, there seems to be much more emphasis now on the holistic eco-social approach, aiming to the system level development of the school community, but also the education system. And we may interpret this as an attempt to continue something that, for instance, higher education researchers have identified, and also leadership researchers identified as Finnish or Nordic tradition to value education as the collective, social, and global common good. But where does this global common good then get its inspiration, and can we maintain that? These are very challenging issues, and there's a risk of decolonizing, failing the decolonization processes here. One good example of this is, for instance, Sami education that has only recently got attention in the context of Finland. And then understanding global as connection between local and global seems to be the challenge still, even here in Finland. And so this is one of the gaps that we need to look into in our research agendas for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elina, for this very broad and inspiring reflection about how to motivate and how to reflect a research community, how to engage them, and on this remark that in sustainability, often this global connectedness, or in the discourse and research on sustainability, often this global connectedness, the question of acceptance, respect to others, and the exchange of perspective might be missing. And thank you very much for having identified very different topics and related them to the Finnish reality, including the Sami people. So thanks again for this inspiring reflections. And our next speaker is Wegimont. He is the Executive Director of GENE and the co-founder of GENE and of Angel. And Liam will speak about some of the achievements and potential of global education and give an overview about the state of the research and the emerging problems and challenges from an European perspective. So, Liam, please.
Thank you, Annette, and good morning all. It's a real delight to be here, and I'd like to add to Annette's words at the start to thank colleagues from EERA and particularly Professor Joe O'Hara for the work that we have done together over the year and for the kind invitation to be involved in this session. I also hope to come to one of his challenging questions in the chat during the presentation, and would encourage others to, if you want to, just use the chat for questions, contradictions, comments. So I'm going to try and start sharing my screen, so forgive me for a moment while I hope to get this right. So bear with me a moment. Now, can you see that? Is that good? Excellent. Well, I want to building on what colleagues have presented, I'd like to suggest that global education has been and continues to be a strategically useful but conceptually challenged concept and is in need of firmer philosophical foundations. But in making the presentation, I do hope to also look at both the challenges within global education that might be addressed by the broader educational research community, and also some of the contributions that the traditions of global education research might provide. First, a word on GENE. We're the network of ministries and agencies with national responsibility for global education and development education in European countries, with one unambiguous and non-neutral agenda, which is about increased and improved global education at national level throughout Europe. And we do, as has been alluded to, use the Maastricht definition of global education, which again, there's nothing neutral about this. It has a values base that is about opening eyes and minds to the realities of the world. It's about justice, about equity, about human rights for all. But we also have unashamedly for the last 20 years tried to use it as an umbrella term to bring together often competing terms for education, for social justice with a local and global dimension. And we have found it useful. Paul Ricoeur talks about the meaning in front of a text. And if you look at the meaning that has emerged in front of the Maastricht Declaration and text, I think what we can see, although this has to be looked at with a certain critical eye because we've been involved, but it has a one-making power. It has been able to bring together national realities, national policies, national practices. It has, to a certain extent, been able to crest the wave of trends in terminology and definition, and does allow for some limited comparability across competing terms, and has gained traction in many national strategies in European countries. And so we've tried to use it as a common language to develop national strategies for a little comparative analysis, for policy learning, and also to intentionally undermine the siloization of competing terms. It has proved a little bit useful. And we've been able to use it in national reviews of global education over a number of years, which build up something of a comparative literature, and also for specific comparative, though self-reporting from ministries and agencies on the state of global education in different countries and on some cross-cutting themes. But there are a number of challenges. And one of the immediate challenges that comes to mind, and some of our participants may be asking this question, the way in which we use this term needs to be contested. And while we use this term in GENE and ANGEL as a pedagogical principle, a policy arena, a community of practice, and an umbrella term, nevertheless, we see that educationalists whose work we admire and in many cases agree with, use this as a negative term to denote a questionable agenda, GERM or the Global Education Reform Movement. And that's one that hasn't gone unnoticed. Klaus Seitz first talked about this contradiction back in 2002, and it's something that we live with and need to perhaps have a conversation about. And it's not just that. While we do acknowledge that there's a hollowness of the concept, we do also believe that that has been what in many ways has made it possible to use this term to bring together other terms. But we do see that there's a foundational problem. And it relates to something that Professor Bourn mentioned earlier, that the genesis of the term and some of the strengths of the term lie in where it comes from: civil society activism, policy dialogue, and interdisciplinary fields that strangely, in merging with education, have seemed to dominate the interdisciplinary field. I may come back to that. But this leads to a series of conceptual limitations. And these contradictions, anomalies, fissures, I think they need to be explored. Questions such as how the concepts have been arrived at the lack of critical thought, as I mentioned, regarding interdisciplinarity, at assumed rather than critically reflected educational models, at a lack of historical analysis, and a number of assumptions regarding everything from the nature of the individual to necessary choices in regard to pedagogies. And so we don't pretend that we come with something shiny and without question, but these questions do lead us to questioning some assumptions regarding the concept of global education. And there are many assumptions within the field, assumptions in regard to what it is to be human and human being and becoming, assumptions in regard to what we mean by knowledge and truth, regarding how we decide about the good, about right and wrong, about how we understand the relationship between education and society, and also how we understand how change happens. There are assumptions in global education regarding how we choose what to teach and learn, and also regarding how we choose how to teach and learn. So there are foundational questions that we believe need to be developed in a more articulate way, and that need more nuanced and more theoretically grounded understandings. We need a more pronounced anthropology, a more detailed ontology, a more contradicted and debated epistemology. We need to explore the field of ethics, of the sociology of education, and we need to question assumptions regarding the relationships between civil society and how the world changes. Of course, we also need to ask questions in regard to pedagogical studies and in regard to curriculum studies. So there are a whole wealth of questions and research fields that need to be explored as we develop further the concept of global education. And having said all that, we have to also acknowledge, and here I answer Professor O'Hara's question a little, we have to ask, what does global education bring to the educational research community? It's a strong reservoir of practice, of policy and research. Global educators in Europe have been debating and mobilizing for the last 50 years or so. I should acknowledge that in some of the Nordic countries, it's more like 60 or 70 years. But in doing so, there's been a recognition of complexity and a whole practice and theory and areas of research around equipping learners to challenge unjust structures. And a series of other strengths around the critique of dominant models, about questions regarding the relationship between education and social change, between the local and the global. There have been experiences, practices, policies, and research in regard to participatory pedagogical processes and other strengths that I believe global education can bring to the dialogue with the educational research community. And what of that broad global education research agenda? It is many and varied, and I won't go into the details here, because if you are interested, these research items and areas and clusters are what has informed the dialogue and conversation towards and during the GENE ERA Research Awards. And so everything from the theoretical base to histories, to issues around evaluation, to some of the areas of emerging fields that Elina and Massimiliano and Doug have mentioned previously. And as I say, won't go into all those details, but please do feel free to find more about this on the GENE website, the Angel Network website, or the EERA website. And finally, I might just say that we have spoken of the Maastricht Declaration and the Maastricht definition of global education, which was developed back in 2002. This year is GENE's 20th anniversary, and in June we launched a process towards a new European Declaration on Global Education to 2050, which will include a return to a revision of and a critique and a building on the Maastricht definition of global education. And we invite you all to be part of that conversation, which we will have in partnership with colleagues in EERA. So I'd like to thank you all, and I hand back to Annette. Thank you.
Liam, thank you very much for this very broad overview and for the inspiring aspects on the emphasis which are given by policymakers related to GENE in regard to research and for this broad aspects of a research agenda. And I think this is very, very inspiring and giving energy to do so and bringing global education research from the margin much more in the center. And I do now open to everybody of you being here in this room, asking questions and giving comments. It was already Joe O'Hara asking a question, and Liam already responded in a way to that. I don't know whether, Joe, you want to emphasize again or have some more details. I don't know whether people can speak. Okay, I think they can't. And there's another question in the chat, which is, so you write in the chat, please, and you engage in the chat. I'm not sure if I can speak, is Joe asking. So that means probably he can't. I don't know this. So, and okay, you can't. So then, of course, there was another important aspect mentioned in the chat, and this is the notion and influence of the digitalization to global education and to global education research. And I would like to ask some of the people here to give a short perspective on that. Liam already mentioned that in the GENE world, there is research on the digitalization, but digitalization, of course, makes a huge emphasis into global learning, global education, and so on. Elina, do you want to say something on that?
Yes, I could. We just published a paper on decolonizing our university level virtual course. And I think addressing us teachers and reflecting as teachers, how do we work and how do we sort of reflect on our own practices as university educators? And this is related to a course called Global Education Development, adding more controversial issues than to this global education term use. So it's not about global education reforms, it's about global education development, what happens in education globally. And we had this virtual course that became very popular in Finland. We offered it to all Finnish universities, and now we have the discussion that we have to offer it to our partner universities as well. And in this virtual course, we invited our scholars, collaborators from different parts of the world to discuss education development in their context and their research on these issues. And we were very happy to have a very good turnout of scholars, what we would call the Global South, instead of us looking at Global South as something that we are working with, our agenda, having the emphasis. And we changed the agenda so that we had our colleagues, scholars from the Global South informing us about their research and teaching us here in Finland. And then the feedback from students was enthusiastic. But then that led us to reflect on our teaching in general in higher education. how do we decolonize our teaching? How do we sort of include these worldviews and also emphasize the important input of our scholars, our colleagues from the Global South? And we identified that, of course, virtual tools, digital learning offers us possibilities. Of course, it's different from face-to-face meetings. And we, mobility from the sustainable development terms is somehow critical. Some students are more critical about traveling by air, going to different contexts. Can we then create spaces for them to learn together? Is an issue. Can they learn together with colleagues from around, where we have very different contexts, very different resources? How do we increase this understanding? That requires also reflection among us teachers in higher education.
Yes,
so just a quick comment.
Yeah, thank you. And it requires reflection on the practice, how we see ourselves as practitioner. But on the other hand side, of course, it needs to reflect as well how this can then be nicely researched by, because this is a challenge as well. We do not have a lot of knowledge about these global and international learning with digital means. Thank you very much, Elina. There's another question in the chat which is focusing and reflecting once again on the question of resistance against this kind of research and how this could be, what could be the strategies beside what we are doing in the moment to get people interested in a contribution to what is needed in the moment. Doug, you have the longest experience from all of us. Maybe that you can share some ideas how to overcome this resistance and how to integrate people into global education research. Please, Doug.
Thank you, Annette. Yes, it has been an ongoing challenge, I think, and I think one of the things I would to mention here is what I said earlier, which is the sense in which this field, where academics and educationists have become involved, has been often commenting on educational practice, right, as evaluators or commentators, rather than identifying independent research. And that's now changing, but I think that's one of the things I think we need to pick up on. And the other thing, the area that we have found most effective is to develop a community of practice around research in these fields, particularly building on encouraging more early career researchers, doctoral level research, or making available master's levels dissertations. So in a sense, it's about building that body of research and evidence that can then be seen to have broader factors and influence. I think the challenge, however, is that we all know that because this area of work has a strong sort of normative and prescriptive focus from policymakers and funders, there is always a tendency to get drawn into, debates about, well, can you produce something for, right? So if I give you an example, in the UK at the moment, we're trying to gather research and evidence around the impact of target 4.7 of the SDGs within the English education curriculum and education system. And we're gathering some interesting evidence. But commentators from civil society organizations are saying, well, actually, is this proving that this is a good thing, right? And they're assuming, right, that actually what your research is to prove something that's really good and already exists. And I think the challenge we have is to encourage a culture that's much more open-ended. And it's the same way about people understanding from a broader educational communities about what's meant by research. And I think this, to me, is one of the things I think we are still engaging with. And I think that's part of the culture to develop. But this is important in itself, rather than saying, how does it support predetermined agendas?
Thank you, Doug. Massimiliano, you're working in the Italo-Spanish language and university culture. So maybe you want to add something from your experiences to this question.
Yes, in particular, I'd like to mention something about the link between digital citizenship and global education, because I do believe that there is a link, especially if you consider global education by highlighting the citizenship education, the global citizenship education, because in this sense, there's a clear link. Not surprisingly, in the recent reform in Italy, introducing or reintroducing civic citizenship education in the school curriculum, there are three main areas in it. One is traditional national citizenship, the other one is education for sustainable development, and the third one is digital citizenship. And well, there's a link in digital citizenship, because if digital citizenship has to do with equipping students with the ability, knowledge, and skills for dealing with active participation in a global society. In this sense, there's a link with the idea of global citizenship. So, I think it's important that to consider citizenship not only related to the national and local context, but if you consider citizenship in a global concept, of course, the implication of using social media, the internet, opportunity, risk, and limitation and constraints are part of this type of commitment and active engagement of people in a global society. However, we should say that according to research, those people who are mostly active in online active participation, political participation, so they succeed in using digital citizenship skills, are mostly white, educated male. So this gap is something that should be considered in thinking on digital citizenship, because it's especially at present, especially an activity aimed at, well, privileged elite. And if this is related to active citizenship, is something that should be contrasted.
Thank you very much, Massimiliano. We have in the chat some more comments to this question and some links to interesting literature and some aspects shared. I don't see any more questions or comments in the moment in the chat. So I would like to come to the last round with a panel and ask you either to comment on something you wanted to comment but didn't have the possibility, or to give a perspective, the future of educational research and global education is. So enhancing a view into the future. Liam, do you want to start?
Yes, Annette, though you caught me engaging with some of the questions here, which I've seen in addition. So I might just add 2 or 3 things to what I see in the chat. First of all, in regard to the overlap and the challenge between global education and digital, I'd simply suggest that it might be interesting to look at recent GENE peer reviews, particularly Estonia and Belgium. And the Belgian practice of engaging in these 2 interrelated fields may be of interest. More broadly, I think that if we look at GENE peer reviews of national situations over time, a focus on support for research used to be something that GENE facilitating the peer review would be knocking on the door of ministries of education, ministries of foreign affairs, saying you need to have support for research. Now, 15, 20 years later, it's more nuanced than that. And it's about how to increase and improve research funds in global education. But I think a really interesting and significant question in the chat is the question of who are we? And I think that, yes, that is something that we need to continuously critically ask. And it is something that global education has been involved in for over 20 years. I think myself that the overlap between global education and what are called additional educational needs, special educational needs, you know, beyond cognitive normativity, I think these are going to be questions that are absolutely crucial, and also questions of socioeconomic exclusion, along with the questions that Black Lives Matters and the Me Too movement raise. So crucial questions, I think.
Thank you. Elina.
Yes, if I may add to this we question, which I also, as Liam says, I also consider it very important. And in one paper, when we asked our students in higher education, you know, students that was an international group and then worked across different contexts through their course, and we asked them, you know, who can make decisions in an education system? And that was very interesting, because most students, because they had been working together in an intensive seminar, then online dialogues and projects, and then we asked them after the course, who is we? And or who can make decisions in education, who can influence education development in the world? And then most people would say the ministries, the UN, somebody like that, because we had studied global education issues and global education development. And so they saw somebody far away. But then it was interesting that after the course, they said that their, you know, views changed. They thought that, well, we can do that because we've been together here now. We are, you know, many people, we've been working already with these international experts, and we've been working with our students around the world, being influenced and connected. And this connection, I think, was very important. So building this community, I would like to come back to that, building this community, not only as a community of practice, but also a community of research and development. So we work together. And that's where I see students as my team members, not as somebody I'm teaching. I'm learning a lot, and that's what I emphasize. And I value that, creating this we, I think is very important.
Yes, and I think this shows as well that research needs to be reflected globally and inclusive, globally inclusive. Doug, do you want to add something? You need to do the microphone.
So yes, I think the whole concept of we is, as others have said, is an important one in the sense of who is talking on behalf of whom. There's a tendency in this some of these educational traditions we're talking about to people who talk on behalf of others without giving space to those voices. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have. But I think our field has been, I think, on the whole, good historically in trying to promote spaces for a range of voices, particularly the disempowered and disenfranchised, to have voices at conferences and events. Sometimes that may have been a bit too tokenistic, but I think there's a desire for that to happen. And I think that's a question we all need to build on, and how we then bring in those minorities and so on. And I know that one of my former master students did a really excellent dissertation and looking at the connections to what extent do refugees in the UK context have a sense of seeing themselves as global citizens, for example, by interviewing and talking to them. So those are sorts of things where I think we can make some connections to some of the current social issues. Secondly, I want to come back to this area about digital citizenship, because I think it can be seen in many different ways. And my own university, University College London, we've been running a master's program on global learning that has always been an online distance learning program. And that has enabled people to participate and dialogue with each other from all four corners of the world. And that has been very effective. And has also meant that people can relate their own personal experience to what they're learning with people elsewhere in the world, right? And so I think there's value in that. There's a question, of course, of power and the relation that there means that people who have access to that form of digital citizenship and digital engagement is very important. But I think it has particularly value And conferences, as we know, this type of the last 18 months have actually been slightly more democratic and open, because they've been able to get far more voices than everyone having to travel or get on a plane to go somewhere. The other factor, I think, about this area, which we haven't explored a lot, and I know someone in the UK is currently looking at this, is the relationship of digital citizenship to the role of social media and the ways in which people communicate and the extent to which people take what's read through social media as truth. And we know the implication of that politically, what's been happening over the last year or so. And I think that's a really important area. So to me, the whole thing about where our field's got an important contribution to play is about critical thinking, and to encourage research and evidence that goes beyond just accepting what you read or see on the internet. And I think that, to me, is very important. And finally, I just wanted to come back to about going forward. To me, if we look at where we are in the world today, in the third decade of the 21st century, we're in a decade where some really big global challenges face real important issues about the future of the human race and the future of this planet. To me, one of the challenges we have as educationists is to ensure that those agendas are not only reflected within education, but are addressed in a positive and constructive way, and not in a threatening way and disempowering way. And to me, the ways in which we can show the sense that education has to be about how people learn to have a sense of social responsibility and social engagement is, to me, becoming, if not has become, one of the dominant social challenges for all educationists today. And to me, that's where I think global educationists around the world have actually got to say much more in bigger terms about some of the big picture questions. What is education for? What's its purpose? And what are we trying to achieve? And to me, I think global education's got a lot to say in that regard. And that's where possibly we should be looking much more in terms of broadening debates and making sure the things we're talking about here feed into broad debates happening at this conference and other conferences in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Massimiliano, a very short last sentence from your side.
Oh yes, very, very short. I was very interested in the Joe question about how global education can engage with the wider community of educational researchers. Of course, this is a huge question, and this is a task for the future. Liam already addressed this point, mentioning all the fields that have been involved. On a practical level, I will just say that the role of global education as a field in the wider research community is twofold, because on the one hand, it is a field that could be, although it's an umbrella term, dialogue on with the similar educational field, especially education for sustainable development. So it's a field in itself, combining the social sphere with the natural sphere, with the concern and responsibility with the global, the environmental and the social sphere. But at the same time, is a transversal perspective. On the other hand, is a transversal perspective, is a framing paradigm, is something, is providing a global view, a global stance to many other disciplines, allowing very disciplines to make sense in a different way to their own traditional topics and issues. So this is a twofold feature of a global education as a research field, as a contribution with the wider educational research community.
Massimiliano, thank you so much. So I hope this session has inspired you and has given some ideas to continue to reflect on global education research and to continue with this kind of research. We want to invite you to the Angel Network, the academic network on global education and learning, angel-network.net, which could be seen on the slide if I now. So we want to invite you to this angel network, and perhaps you would like to join and you would work together in a community of researchers. Of course, we are looking forward to further cooperation with EERA, and of course there will be some more presentations on the ECER network as well. And we thank you very much. We thank everybody who had been here for participating. We thank everybody who was presenting. We thank very much for this opportunity of having had this possibility to reflect together. And we thank the European Commission and the national ministries supporting GENE, including Angel and including the GENE EERA Award. And once again, we want to invite you to look to the GENE EERA Award and to accompany this coming research from a lot of researchers in Europe. You may now continue to chat in the meeting point in case you want to. And we look forward to see you tomorrow, perhaps from 10:30 to 12 on research on another meeting on research and global citizenship. So perhaps we see again tomorrow on Friday. So thank you very much that you have been joining us, and enjoy the conference further. Bye.